Hi, everyone. Welcome to Historically Speaking, an online YouTube history channel focused on the history of various institutions and professionals, how history intersects with education and culture, and gender equality, and all of these different issues in the world around us. I'm Karen Yang. I'm the host of Historically Speaking. And today I have here with me Diana Bailey, the Executive Director of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. The Maryland Women's Heritage Center recognizes, documents, and celebrates the contributions of Maryland women, past and present, to our social, political, and economic order. And by doing so, they champion opportunities and equality for women and girls. Ms. Bailey, in particular, has been an educator and a really important administrator and has a lot of experience working with education, training, employment, and STEM career pathways. And she was a member of the Maryland Commission for Women and is currently a member of the advisory board of the Howard County Women's Giving Circle, vice chair of the National Gender Equity Leadership in Education, and has made a huge impact on kind of elevating women's stories and their history. So we're really grateful that she's here with us today. Diana, do you have anything else you'd like to add about your bio or the Women's Heritage Center or anything else like that?
No, but thank you so much, Karen, for that great introduction. And you probably can tell I've been doing gender equity work for many decades.
Mhm.
Frankly, I'd hoped by this time in my career that although we've made great strides in so many areas, we still have so much more work to do with
For
so
sure.
many different groups of women. I
Hmm.
mean, I'd like to retire sometime, but I'll never be able to retire till everything is all fixed and all ready. So I was
Hmm.
pleased when they asked me to serve. I was on the advisory board of the Women's Heritage Center for many years when I was at the State Department of Education.
Hmm.
So this is
Hmm.
one of my retirement gigs to be the executive director part-time. And the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, clearly stated our mission, but I think the simple way I like to say it is adding her story to history to tell our story. So many of our exhibits and programs and information on the website is geared around that simple statement so that we're trying to provide that information both for students or adults that continue to be surprised about the roles of diverse women and girls in our communities.
For sure. I think that's a really, really great message. And I really like kind of your slogan with the her story adding to history to become our story, because I think history isn't necessarily the most inclusive the way that we are learning it in school or being taught that in school. And definitely like doing more work in this way and expanding her story for sure is going to be really, really essential. And honestly, I love the work you guys are doing for sure. I guess our first question is, so in your view, what makes the Women's Heritage Center and like museums as a whole so important in today's society? And what do you think we can learn from the Women's Heritage Center's history and your current exhibitions, I guess?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. We had an interesting start with the Maryland
Hmm.
Commission for Women and the Maryland Legislative Caucus in 1985. So that may seem like generations ago to you, but
Hmm.
that was when the movement started for a lot of the women's history events. The proclamations were coming out at the national and state level. So the Commission for Women, with other partners, sponsored the first Women's Hall of Fame in Maryland in
Oh.
1985 with some of the super rock stars that you would imagine that would be in the first Hall of Fame, like Rachel Carson and Harriet
Hmm.
Tubman and many others. Well, only five
Hmm.
others, but we had to pick up the most famous probably of the Maryland women at that time. But
Hmm.
in 1985, they had a very fabulous ceremony at Annapolis. Governor was
Hmm.
there, lots of the other legislators and organizations. But then they had a great event. Of course, there wasn't much video then. There was a lot of still pictures. But
Hmm.
then the plaque went to the Maryland Archives. It was a very lovely plaque, but because American Archives was not really a visitor's location, the
Hmm.
plaque was never to be seen again until the
Oh
next year.
no.
So there were a lot
Hmm.
of people, a lot of women and a lot of feminists and women's history people that said, we've got to get these stories out there. So at that time, the Maryland State Department of Education was doing the women's history packets, which were
Hmm.
educational units that went to all the schools in Maryland. And they had a
Hmm.
variety of topics from early STEM to women in communication, law, sports, and so on. And that was
Hmm.
federally funded at that time. So, but there was a great network of people across the state of Maryland that were working on those women's history packets, which are kind of like bulletin board packets from the old days or
Mhm,
lesson
mhm,
plans, but they're really trying to get those stories out there. We didn't have the internet for much then at all. So it was really, it was a tough way to get those stories out, particularly diverse
mhm,
stories. So over
mhm,
the years, there was a huge effort to find a location so that the Maryland Women's Heritage Center could exist as a place like any other center and museum where students and adults could come to learn.
mhm,
Now, over the years, it took years to find a place and be able to afford a place, raise the money, all those kinds of things. But eventually we did. And at that
mhm,
same time, there was a lot of interest in other topics like pay equity, a matter of choice. There was a lot of family community service activities that were going on, as well as the history. But for
mhm,
those of us from education, we think that unless people can see themselves or you see other diverse women doing whatever role they want to do,
mhm.
you always think you're the first. Well, generally now you're not the first anymore, which is a good thing.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there's a lot of people that don't have access to those stories or that visibility. So we
Mhm,
really wanted to try to, provide those in our exhibits. So we've had exhibits of Maryland women in the arts, Maryland women in STEM. Our newest exhibit is the Valiant Maryland Women, the Fight for the Vote.
mhm,
Um, we have again the Hall of Fame exhibit. We had a very large physical one, but our new
mhm,
space is too small. So now Notre Dame University has our large physical exhibit,
mm,
and they're working to have a kiosk,
mhm,
which will be more computer oriented and all that sort of stuff, but it's much smaller. So
mhm,
most of our exhibits are portable. So for example, this week I'm taking the STEM exhibit to one of the state office buildings to have in their
oh
lobby
wow.
for several months. And other exhibits will go around the state for like AUW is having a state conference. So not only
Mhm,
do we have our physical space where students can come, adults can come for the tours, but we
mhm,
try to get as many of our exhibits out in the community as possible. Just because,
mhm.
especially after COVID, people still aren't traveling much yet. They're
Yeah, for
not
sure.
going to museums as much. So we've been updating our website like everybody else to have as much educational information on our website as possible as
Mhm,
well.
100%.
Mhm.
I really loved like all of these different things that you told me about, like starting with the idea of like, hey, we can't just have this plaque just disappear after like this one awesome event. Like we deserve to constantly be reminded by these kind of events and constantly like just don't store away that piece of history that we can obviously interact with much more often and that we should interact with much more often. And I really like the idea of now not being just like one museum but necessarily being much more fluid in the events that you're hosting, in the educational opportunities that you guys are providing. I think this like kiosk idea is super cool, and like your ability to kind of move this thing around and affect different people at different times at these central locations is so important for sure. And I really liked how everything seems really diverse, which is really important. And I really liked also your idea of like, hey, if you shouldn't feel that you're the first one undertaking this huge daunting responsibility. And I can definitely see all these kiosks just kind of being at different locations and having these different girls or these different audiences seeing these things realize that, hey, I'm not alone in my pursuit of STEM or medicine or arts or any of these different fields for sure. It's definitely interesting. What has been your own favorite like event or exhibition in the Women's Heritage Center's history? Or do you have like a particular favorite or anything like that?
That's a really hard one because they're real, for me anyway, they're real different. I know one of the things that when I was working with the State Department of Education, I kind of was always doing some of the gender equity stuff, which was a cool thing. So
Mhm,
we had the opportunity to partner with the Applied Physics Lab, which is apply a part of Johns Hopkins University. And
mhm,
about 15 years ago, we worked with them and the Women's Giving Circle in Howard County in partnership um, to start what we called Girl Power. And
mhm,
at that time, there weren't as many special programs for girls exploring STEM careers. For example,
mhm,
Girls Who Code wasn't available yet. Some of the
mm,
young women in engineering. So at APL, um, they sponsored the Girl Power event on a Sunday afternoon, and there would
mhm.
be 500 to 1,000 girls and their
Oh,
parents that would come for these hands-on experiences. Now,
Mhm.
APL has the lead on that the last couple of years, or the last couple of years before COVID. But
Mhm.
we were excited that we could be one of the early facilitators of making that happen,
Mhm.
because there was some activities in the school systems, but not all school systems, because we
Mhm.
had girls and their mostly and their parents that would drive them up. But we had
Yeah.
families from the Eastern Shore or Western Maryland or Southern Maryland that came to Howard County because there was nothing like that in their counties. So it was a
Mm.
major career exploration event. So that was
Mhm.
very cool. So I love that.
Mhm. Mhm.
All the Hall of Fame ceremonies that are in Annapolis that the commission hosts are just
Mhm.
breathtaking.
Mhm.
Most of the time, if the inductees are still living, they tell
Mhm.
their stories. If they're
Oh
not,
wow.
the people that have nominated them tell their story, and it's very
Mhm.
personal. And so you get to know these women that
Mhm.
did sometimes amazing stuff, but sometimes they were very much unsung. For example,
Mhm.
with Henrietta Lacks, when she was inducted in the Hall of Fame, her family came,
Mhm.
and one of her granddaughters was there, but she
Mhm.
hadn't even known the story of her own grandmother.
Oh
Um,
wow.
she knew she'd had cancer and that she died at a very young age, but she didn't
Mhm.
know the rest of it about her.
Mhm.
So of
Mhm.
course now there's books and television and all that, but
Mhm.
for that young woman to not
Mhm.
really know the rest of the story of her grandmother was kind of
Mhm.
unfortunate.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
so then we have other women in there that were early pilots during World War II. Well, who knew there were so many women
Yeah.
pilots and so many people that were doing things? And then when Elaine Harmon was an adult, grown up, she facilitated getting other women in the military, particularly from World War II,
Mhm.
permission to be buried in Arlington. And so
Mhm.
for a military person, that's a
Mhm.
big deal. So
Yeah. Yeah.
he worked on that for years.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of story. She was no one knew her name before this either. And there's
Mhm.
like Dr. Nancy Welker, who was
Mhm.
kind of like a hidden figure, was at NSA, National Security Agency, but
Mhm.
because of her security clearance, that she and all the other women who were the coders and doing the
Mhm.
secret stuff, no one knew that she was there, just like in the movie Hidden Figures. They
Oh
just,
wow.
there were so many. So it's
Mhm.
great that Nancy and a couple others are now in the Hall of Fame. But more importantly, in their case, they have an organization that we've partnered with to do a virtual session. They're called
Mhm.
Queens of Code. So who knew? So,
Yeah.
that not only was it in a secret environment, but that their stories weren't being told until now. And it was a community
Mhm.
person, Eileen Buchholz, who made that happen. She's
Mhm.
a kind of a, I shouldn't say a normal person because nobody's normal, but she's a ordinary person who worked there. But it was her mission to have her stories told. So
Mhm.
that's so I
Oh.
think we like being out at public events. We went out
Mhm.
to Western Maryland last summer, and we'll be there again for the Chautauqua event, which is a community thing, but we'll be doing an unveiling of a suffrage marker out there in July,
Ooh.
and there'll be other examples of what Julia Rule did as a community person, but she
Mhm.
single-handedly in some cases worked to get voting rights for Garrett County and then down into back into Baltimore. So
Oh
all
wow.
these so that they're all so different. And I've I didn't know women's history when I was a kid because the only people I knew or read about was Amelia Earhart and
Mhm.
probably Clara Barton. And
Mhm.
that was about it. And it wasn't until I was a grown up and moved to Maryland that I really knew much about Harriet Tubman at all. And that's
Mhm.
pathetic.
Mhm.
That's very bad. But again, generationally, I've had students that have come to our center
Mhm.
that didn't recognize Harriet, did not recognize
Oh
Barbara
no.
Mikulski, did not recognize, um, other people that you would think that would be in their realm. So
Mhm.
we're trying to
Mhm.
put their faces and their stories back in front of them again.
Yeah. I really like this like Hall of Fame idea because it makes these people really like not only does it bring their stories to light, it also makes them seem more human and not just even just like, oh, like all these glossy statistics maybe in your A push book that maybe say like, oh yeah, all these women maybe if they were these female pilots, like pilots, women could start being pilots in like 1942 or something, but now you're like hearing their story, hearing their
Right.
experiences, and you can see parts of yourself in their like in their stories and their triumphs and their tragedies. And I feel like a lot of what history and what being equal means is just connecting with one another and
Mhm.
facilitating that connection through these different great events sounds super interesting. And definitely, I think even it seems that the Women's Heritage Center spans like a lot of different activities and touches a lot of different people's lives, both with like the coding and the STEM and also this Women's Hall of Fame kind of idea. I definitely think that like personally, I even want to kind of bring this like Women's Hall of Fame idea to New Jersey or where I am currently, or spread it maybe to just a lot more places. I think this is definitely such a really cool idea for sure.
There are some other Hall of Fames in other states, but not enough.
Hmm.
Because we found
Yeah,
that
for sure.
we work with the National Collaborative Women's History Sites, and
Hmm.
they tend to be volunteers,
Hmm.
and they tend to pull things together when they can.
Hmm.
New York has done a lot of work, California, of course, and a few other places. But early on, we were one of
Hmm.
the first and only women's heritage
Hmm.
centers. So
Hmm.
other places have started up, and then other people have had similar challenges of staying in existence, frankly.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think like it's so easy, especially if it's just really volunteer driven, to be like, oh, this is so hard because throughout history, like no one's really highlighting these women's stories. So definitely doing the research and hunting through all of these like different resources is really, really difficult. But it's also just kind of highlighting further the importance of doing that work and being willing to look through all of those resources for sure.
Well, yeah, the other thing for those that their view they're in New Jersey, I mentioned the National Collaborative Women's History Sites, but also on their Votes for Women Trail, there's a
Hmm.
lot of places that are identified from New Jersey, but also other
Hmm.
different states. So it is going virtually more so for
Hmm.
researching, but again, I still think that nothing beats actually physically being somewhere.
Of course,
Like
of
if you're in New
course.
York State, to go to Seneca Falls, or if you're in DC, to go
Hmm.
to the Bethune House, or to any other place that's brick and mortar,
Hmm.
just to
Hmm.
feel the presence of some of that.
That's so true. I think it's like, again, I think I had a conversation with somebody else in some other museum, but I think it's just like the physical presence of being in this room or being in this museum that also really ensures that you really fully grasp all the history and all the understanding. Because like I think the idea that like, hey, I stood in this place where someone else stood who did all these courageous things and maybe one day can be something like that as well. And I also think that while we can't always achieve that with all of these kiosks and all these like movable parts of the museum and heritage center, doing what you can with that is also really, really important for sure as well. I think one more question will kind of wrap everything up. How do you think just like people outside of Maryland or people outside of just like your immediate like Women's Heritage Center like location or area can help support this mission or help continue to tell the story, her story essentially to bring our story to life?
Well, one of the things that we really experienced in the last few years, for obvious reasons, for the 100th anniversary of the right to vote, that was our focus, like most women's sites. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but it was really difficult because so much of women's history is still buried. So one
Hmm.
of the things that people can do is to shine a light on those
Hmm.
women in their lives in the past or the present.
Hmm.
A lot of that information is in somebody's basement. It could be in their garage, or it could be in journals or Bibles or other documents that it's hard sometimes to document them as primary source, but it
Hmm.
still provides the stories
Hmm.
that are so important for people to learn,
Hmm.
particularly outside of the normal realm, because we for example, um, the diversity during the suffrage movement, there was a million things going on in the African American community and in the Asian community and the
Hmm.
Hispanic community, but we don't
Hmm.
know about it
Hmm.
because it's hidden somewhere. So that's
Hmm.
where we
Yeah.
need people to bring out, because there were folks that were working in the labor unions that were particularly hardworking women that were in the mills and the factories, but they
Hmm.
were doing a lot because they could see the importance of votes for women for their family and their children. So,
Hmm.
but they didn't tell their stories. Some of them couldn't read or write, but they knew what they were doing. So
Hmm. Hmm.
we've spent a lot of time building those stories, building the resources on websites like the Votes for Women Trail. But we need to have those kinds of resources for women in general, not just because we
Yeah, for
focus on the
sure.
vote. So STEM is pretty good, just because there was a focus in the schools and other places for the last couple of years and some funding, to be honest.
Hmm.
but we don't know a lot about women entrepreneurs, particularly. We know about the big famous ones that give away a lot of money, which is wonderful because they've
Mhm.
used their resources to benefit others and other programs. But we
Mhm.
kind of don't know the unsung heroines. So those
Yeah.
are the unsung heroines are the ones that keep the world moving.
Mhm.
The famous ones are wonderful and they're so important, but it's the everyday people that get up, go to work, take care of their families, come home, and then do whatever they do at night to keep on going.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
the bulk of the people that, and particularly
Mhm.
it's the bulk of the women. And we saw that during COVID,
Yeah, for
which was
sure.
hard, that they were working from home or they were doing homeschooling at home or they were
Mhm.
whatever they were doing and then taking care of their grandmother or their mom or dad. Not that the men weren't busy too, I don't mean that. But when you look at the recent research, the disparate impact on women was significant.
Mhm.
Many of
Mhm.
them did not go back to work, can't go back to work for a while, or if they did, they went to a part-time position because they could not do it all. They couldn't,
Mhm.
couldn't.
Mhm.
So I couldn't. Um, so I think that's going to put another spin's not the right word, but it's going to put another element on women's history for
Mhm.
not just the past 2 years, but the 2 years before, the 2 years we're moving
Mhm.
into now. How do
Mhm.
they catch up? Because so
Mhm.
many women, well, because if they went to part-time or changed jobs, they're out of their retirement money, they're out of Social Security changes.
Mhm.
So we're looking
Mhm.
at the financial impact on those choices they had to make.
Mhm.
So it's a little worrisome. So I
Mhm.
think we need
Mhm.
to pay attention. The communities need to pay attention to what's happening to women, women of color, women that are in essential positions but don't get paid that way.
Yeah,
For me, I could work at home most of the time and my income did not change. Um, but for a lot of other people,
it did. Yeah.
they were not so privileged. So
Mhm.
how do we take care of those, particularly women and their children, as we move out of, hopefully move out of the pandemic? And it's sort of like moving out of a hurricane. So how do you
Yeah.
do the cleanup and the
Catching
restoration
up.
after all this,
Mhm.
um, and minimize to the degree you can the disparate impact that hit women?
Yeah, for sure. I think like definitely I think what you aim to do or like I think all of us should do is just to kind of look at our local impact, check in with everyone and really acknowledge the roles that women play that often go unseen and unheard, but
Mhm.
nonetheless kind of propel us to keep going forward. So I definitely think that that's something that we should all strive to do and something that we can all take part in essentially as well for sure. But thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. Do you have any like last minute remarks or anything else like that or anything else?
Well, just thank you for your interest in this. I mean, personally, I'm thrilled to see a young woman that's interested in this topic, and I hope you have a lot of friends that are interested as well.
Yeah, for sure, for
Because
sure.
at some point we want to pass the torch,
Mhm.
and I'm sorry we're not further along, but we've done pretty well. But
Mhm.
we're still looking to have the ERA passed. We're still
Mhm.
looking um, to make sure that in the workplace there's equity and comfort and
Mhm.
safety and all that. So we still
Mhm.
have a lot of work to do, but I do want to celebrate where we've been and where
Yeah,
we
for
are,
sure.
but then get other people to keep us
To
moving.
join us. Yeah, for sure.